101. This is Silverio Aro, and I'm going to be introducing the first part of our textbook by um, James Diego Vigil. James Diego Vigil, our author, he begins his thesis by establishing the enormity of this group of people in the United States, Mexican Americans. And he begins by telling us, well, first of all, Latinos represent the largest minority group in the United States, and of that group, 65% are Mexican Americans. Now, this is important because his premise of his book, obviously, is that he he wants us to understand Chicanos. In order to understand Chicanos, you have to understand Mexicans. In order to understand Mexicans, you have to go back. All right, and you go back to this place called Aztlan. He's introducing this notion, this homeland of Chicanos, uh, by bringing our attention to Aztlan. It's an important aspect to his thesis, as history and maps peg Mexicans as originating from the United States Southwest. The Four Corners, if you will, is where Aztlan is thought to have been, its actual place. So not only do Mexican Americans, including Mexican Americans and Chicanos, cover the entire country of Mexico, they also inhabit a large area of the United States, hence the idea of an in-between people. These folks have transitioned and are moving between places and cultural settings. Last, Vigil also supports the belief that Chicanos are reconnecting to their Mexican roots, a process unlike other ethnic groups that experience greater disconnect with mother cultures as time and generations pass. Now, dynamic history. He introduces this notion of dynamic history, and this is what he's getting at. Most Chicano studies primers point to Chicano history as beginning in the United States in the last 60, 70 years. Now, his argument is that Chicano history actually began over 5,000 years ago, when pre-Columbian history is taken into account. Now, pre-Columbian history, or if you will, pre-Hispanic period, is that history, culture, tradition, language that were here before Columbus, before the Hispanics, before the Spanish. And so we have groups like the Aztecs, the Mexica, the Toltecs, the Mayan, the Cora, etc. Um, while the Spanish came and conquered the Mexican pre-Columbian civilization over a period of centuries, and in the process interjecting Spanish history and traditions, languages and religion into Mexico, Vigil argues that this displacement process from the conquest, and then that again is supplanted with a conflict with Anglos after the US-Mexican War, it produces this ongoing process of dynamic history. He points to this merging of old and new world cultural styles, old being the indigenous culture. He uses his book to revisit these periods of conquest and war, whereby Mexican indigenous cultures are merged with Spanish ones, and then later with Anglo ones. He contends that the merging process is ongoing, even to this day. Now, in order for us to understand this, Vigil came up with this dynamic, as he calls it, a dynamic approach to as an assessment tool. Because Vigil's premise stipulates that the process of merging is ongoing, in other words, it not just happened and then it was over. No, this process is still going on. It's dynamic, the opposite of stagnant or static. His assessment tool examines not only the people of indigenous Mexico, but the aftermath of the conquest from the result of the Spanish colonization process. After all, a colony is a system of exploitation of resources and people. So, as in any conflict, there are winners and there are losers, and Vigil establishes a systematic assessment tool to account for these losses. Vigil, one of the more important tenets of Vigil's model is that the Mexica, the Mexicano, the Aztecs, if you will, these indigenous people, um, operated in a civilization where they held power using their native system of land, cultivation, and trade, along with their system of education and social structures, their thoughts, their ideas, their philosophies. All right. They possessed all of this because it was their culture. And after the conquest, essentially, indigenous people lost their autonomy. They lost all of this after the conquest, after these conflicts. So, whereas the fruits of their labor were theirs before, after these conquests, they were no longer theirs. But now the Spaniards, for example, these natives went from positions of power to that of subservient. In other words, they reported to someone else. So I thought about the analogy of, let's say, the Aztecs, if you will, they operated and owned their own factory. And then after they got bought out by force, they were now relegated to this position of just being worker bees. They were expendable, they were interchangeable. Whatever they produced was no longer theirs. It belonged to someone else. So that's this process that he takes us down this path of this transformation from indigenous people into peasants. And he does this by introducing this notion of peasants. Now his language is very intentional. He wants this label peasant because not only does it kind of hark back to this pre-industrial society where a majority of the people in Middle Ages were peasants, but the loose application of this word peasant is often or frequently used to describe traditional rural populations and countries where these small landholders farm the land. And in more recent time, peasant is sometimes used as a pejorative, a negative word, not a good one, to consider those people as lower class. They're poorly educated and low income. They're poor. Okay, so he's using this term intentionally, peasants. And with that process of going from indigenous to peasant to immigrant, he he is postulating that the roles have remained the same, but the relationship has shifted as well as the labels. All right, so that's why he has this process of, in this title of his book, from Indians to immigrants, and um, this is where he begins. So now, how he does this is he categorized the history of Chicanos into four major historical periods: pre-Columbian, Spanish colonial, Mexican independence and nationalism, Anglo-Americans, and Mexicanization as the last. So four periods. And with this, he then overlays this with these, what he calls the 6 C's: class, culture, color, contact, conflict, and change. And he goes on to describe exactly what he means for each of those 6 C's. Now, what he does then, he takes the 6 C's and he draws us a diagram. He puts it in a visual for us. And so you can see that it's a timeline almost at the top where it began, if you will, with the pre-Columbian, and it worked its way down to the Anglo-American and Mexicanization period. And then, if you could, he leaves that little caveat there, and the process continues. In other words, it's still going on. And so you can see where he interjects the 6 C's into each period and does this analysis for us that walks us to how these people, these indigenous people, these Indians, became immigrants, and how the relationship between class, culture, color, contact, conflict, and change um, is is um, is connected. All right. Now, what this diagram does here, it's trying to I'm trying to capture the particular ever ever evolving dynamic process of his model. So if you think of this is like an ever repeating process where you start off with contact, you have conflict, then that results in change. Well, that change is only for a little while because then you have more contact, which creates conflict, which creates change. And then it goes on and on and on. So he then concludes that this process of conflict and change and what have you, it's not good, but it's also not exactly bad in the sense that there are positive outcomes that can be drawn. One of them is that he considers Chicanos as epitomizing the ability of modern colonized people to adopt. What does that mean? Well, easy. Other parts of the world have been colonized by other um, imperial powers, Britain and France and etc. And he contends that even though Mexicans had to go through this, they've kind of come out in a better place, in better shape, if you will. And he credits this perseverance for their ability to integrate and synthesize past racial and cultural mixtural experiences. In other words, there's an integration, a melding that's going on. And if you think about it, it's a building process. You have one foundation of culture, and then another culture comes along and overlays on top of it. So instead of stacking, it actually kind of starts melding together, and then another stack, etc. And this the flexible, comprehensive approach has led to the perseverance of Mexicans. And last, he considers Mexicans as a diverse bunch. You have every shape, size, and color, religious, um, ethnic group, racial group in Mexico. And what it does, it's this process over hundreds of years has created this la raza cósmica, a cosmic race. In other words, it's drawing from the cosmos. It's not just limiting itself to one part of the world, it's drawing from all parts of the world. So, anyways, I conclude here, and I will see you online soon enough.